Before we jump in, we want to take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, Marvin Planning Consultants. Marvin Planning Consultants was established in 2009 and is committed to our clients and our professional organizations. Our team of planners have served on chapter, division, and national committees, including as Nebraska chapter president. In addition, we are committed to supporting our chapter in various APA divisions. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Booked on Planning. In today's episode, we're covering Place and Prosperity by Bill Fulton. The title is pretty descriptive of the contents of the book, which is all about how intertwined place is with creating prosperity in cities. It's a really quick read, composed of Bill's thoughts on planning over a long career in the public and private sectors, as well as an elected official, which I thought gave him a pretty unique perspective on the subject.
Yeah, I was actually surprised when he said that being an elected official was his favorite role. After reading the book and through some of his other publications, I thought it might have been as a policy director, given his background in journalism.
Yeah, I agree. And I love the question that we had posed to him because it's always interesting to see where people think that they have the biggest impact. And one of my favorite tidbits that came out of our conversation was the idea that he shared that he got from a friend about how to get engineers to think differently about cities, not as just places to get traffic through. We know engineers like to solve problems, which traditionally has been how to move traffic more efficiently. But as Bill said, what if the problem they need to solve is instead how to create meaningful places where residents have access to things that they need on a daily basis?
Yeah, in a past life, I worked at a private engineering firm for a while, and I agree with his idea that reframing the problem is a great way to re-engage engineers. My favorite part of the discussion was how the film industry can help people begin to think about place.
Yeah, and I think since Bill spent many years in Ventura, California, very near the heart of the film industry, he had some pretty interesting insights on that topic. Well, let's get into our conversation with Bill Fulton on Place and Prosperity. Well, thank you for joining us on Booked on Planning, Bill, to talk about your book, Place and Prosperity. You've been an urban planning professor, mayor, planning director of a big city, partner in an urban planning firm, and a policy director for a nonprofit organization. So you really have done it all, it seems. In which role did you feel you had the greatest impact on improving the sense of place and prosperity?
Boy, that's a really good question. As a planning consultant, what you tend to do is parachute into a city and try to figure it out really fast and try to help people, and then you leave. I think probably where I had the greatest impact was as an elected official, as a city council member and a mayor. That was in Ventura, California, which is a beach town in between LA and Santa Barbara. And I think part of it was that I lived there for 25 years and I was an elected official for 8. So I knew the city intimately, and it was not easy to get things done in an improved place, but it was more of a sustained effort than I've done in some of my other roles. And also very hands-on, because every Monday night something would come to us where we had a decision, like improve place or not. So it was a very direct role. More so, I think, even than being the planning director of San Diego, which was a high-level position as well, but didn't get quite down and dirty on the decisions. It was a more long-range planning thing.
In your opening chapter, you discuss the thickening of the cities in the West and the thinning in the cities of the East. I thought that was a really fascinating concept, and I was wondering if you could explain further what you mean by thickening and thinning, of course, and then the impact that it had on place.
That's a good question. I came up with that concept. I grew up in upstate New York, near Cornell, and then I lived for most of my adult life in Southern California, near Los Angeles. I wrote that essay in response to a conference at Cornell on the thinning metropolis, meaning upstate New York, an area that has stagnant or declining population, even though it still has sprawl. And just the contrast between a region that it was not growing in population and yet was sprawling across the landscape, as was the case in upstate New York. Also the case in Michigan, for example, where some people say, what's happening in Michigan is the population of Detroit is being redistributed across the entire state. So the contrast between that and Los Angeles, which, although not vertically dense, is horizontally dense, small lots for houses, a pretty confined space, even though it's large, was really striking to me. And then the cultural differences as well were so striking to me, because in that essay, one of the things I talk about is growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in and how all the kids in the neighborhood used to run back and forth through everybody's backyard every afternoon, including families that didn't have children. And I was trying to explain to my daughter she's grown up now, but I was trying to explain to her when she was about 9 that we used to do this. And having grown up in Southern California where everybody had at least a fence, if not a wall, she just didn't believe me. So I found the contrast striking. Now, California is now stagnant or declining in population itself for the first time ever. So we will see whether California begins to thin out as well, or whether it will continue to thicken. The thing that really struck me as I was thinking about this in upstate New York, though, is that and this is part of the theme of the book, is there are wonderful small cities in upstate New York and throughout the Northeast and Midwest that are real urban gems, that many of which have come back, even if their regions are still somewhat depressed over the last 20 years, and especially during COVID.
Another topic from your book that I'm going to ask you to elaborate on a little bit is this idea of informalism. So in the book, you talk about new urbanism and how to be successful, it needs to do a better job of incorporating and accepting this idea of informalism instead of considering it impure.
There are two competing urban design traditions in the United States, which in the book I call formalism and informalism. And formalism is, the traditional town square, grid streets, best exemplified in the history of urban planning by the work of John Nolan, Nolen, who was a famous urban planner in the first part of the 20th century. His crowning achievements were Venice, Florida, and Marymount outside of Cincinnati. He represented one tradition. The other tradition, which is kind of the suburban tradition, is informal in the sense that you have curvilinear streets. You don't emphasize fancy public buildings. There's more of a focus on the private realm. The new urbanists, who I've generally been supportive of, tend to favor the formal over the informal, and they tend to sort of diss the informal as being too suburban, not walkable, not truly urban. And while I agree with them in some ways, you realize that most successful communities have both. That you might have a downtown that is very formal, but you might also have residential neighborhoods, and particularly upscale residential neighborhoods that are informal, that have curvilinear streets, large lots, may not be very walkable. So I think the lesson for me was that you can't be too dogmatic about one design tradition over another. You have to understand how they both work, what conditions, what context they work in, and when they can work together to create a full community.
Well, and speaking of sometimes being a little dogmatic in how you approach planning, you also discuss how many of the communities today are still stuck in a 20th century solution of simply retaining the status quo. And many planners revert back to the retro idea of doing nothing, which is actually doing something. It's just not a productive something. So how can we help planners get past this?
The two of you actually read the entire book. That's great. I'm not sure anybody else read the entire book, but we are already seeing this happen to some extent with the YIMBY movement. And, I spent most of my career in California where sort of NIMBY versus YIMBY, that's kind of ground zero for NIMBY versus YIMBY. I would say that many planners of my generation, and I'm in my 60s, who came of age, say in the 1970s, partly as a result of an environmental ethic, and also who embraced environmental review as part of their practice, either through the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, or through one of the state mini NEPAs, the most prominent of which is the one in California, which gets trashed all the time. But it would be an oversimplification to say that nothing is better than something. In other words, that there was a philosophy in the 60s and 70s at the beginning of the environmental movement that any change is bad. And so therefore the solution to that is no change at all. But as you say, doing nothing is doing something. Seeking to retain the status quo is making a decision about how to do things. And I think over time that has snapped back against those planners and those citizen activists, particularly as housing prices have gone up, as our infrastructure has become overloaded. And we have come to realize that there are even environmental consequences to doing nothing. And maybe doing the right thing is sometimes better than doing nothing. I think that is a great lesson of the last, particularly 10 years, and the great lesson of the run-up in housing prices. You know, the end result of doing nothing in the United States and in California especially has been severe underproduction of housing, which has led to low inventory and high prices, which has been bad for everybody except for those who own those houses and have seen the run-up. And those are typically the most politically active people in any community, for better or worse.
So specifically here in Lincoln, looking at our housing, we have a lot of residents and neighborhood organizations that really kind of clamor about new housing developments that don't require parking as part of them. Our downtown district especially doesn't have any parking requirements for any developments. And they fight it because it's going to cause congestion, and then no one will come visit the district because all the parking is going to be taken up, and see it as a way of ruining our vibrant districts.
It kind of reminds me of the old Yogi Berra joke that nobody goes to that restaurant anymore. It's too crowded. So let me guess this straight. If there's no parking, no one will go there because everyone is already there and they're taking up all the parking. I'll tell you a story from my time as mayor of Ventura. I am very much a Shoupista, by which I mean to say a devotee of Donald Shoup, the parking guy, who was my professor at UCLA many years ago. And when I became mayor of Ventura, we instituted a Shoupian parking policy. We did a parking survey. We found where the parking was most heavily used in our downtown, and we put paid parking into those locations. Not in the entire downtown, only in those areas where the parking was used 100% of the time. The net result of that was a difference between perception and reality. Prior to the paid parking being instituted, the main street in Ventura was always very crowded with cars going slowly looking for parking spaces. After the paid parking went in, there was no longer any cruising for parking on Main Street. People who wanted to pay paid, and people who didn't want to pay went to the literally 1/2 block away free parking lots. The perception on the part of many people was, oh, downtown is now dead, because they didn't see cars cruising for parking along Main Street. And this was during the Great Recession. In fact, retail sales and sales tax went up, in part because, to be perfectly honest, people who are willing to pay for parking are also more likely to spend more money. So I think there's a misperception about parking, that if it is not extremely plentiful, something bad will happen. And if a business district such as downtown Lincoln has a tight parking situation and is congested and has a lot of people, that's actually a sign of success, not a sign of failure. I would also say that it is my philosophy you have to be smart about managing all of the parking in the district. You can reduce or eliminate parking requirements as long as you're realistic about how many cars the people who shop and live there are likely to have and where they're going to park. I'll give you another example. One of the most successful land use policies I've ever seen in my whole life was the adaptive reuse ordinance in Los Angeles. Los Angeles had beautiful 1920s office buildings that were unoccupied in the upper floors. About 20 years ago, had retail on the ground floor. About 20 years ago, the city changed its policy and said that if you change the use of an office building in downtown LA, you don't have to provide the parking. This immediately created a huge boom in loft conversions of old unoccupied office space to lofts. Having said that, I will also say that the policymakers in Los Angeles well knew that downtown LA had lots of parking elsewhere. You didn't have to provide parking in every location. You just have to make sure there's sufficient parking in the district. And you have to manage that parking well so that in the places where parking is overloaded, you have paid parking, and in other locations, maybe you make it free so that people are willing to walk a block. So I think it's a management issue. Most places like downtown Lincoln have more than enough parking, even if new developments do not provide much parking. It's just a matter of how you manage it.
Yeah, we had Don on last year on one of our episodes to talk about the high cost of free parking, and it was a very interesting conversation. I think his book and his guidance is really a critical part and plays into creating space if you're managing parking well enough.
But as I say, managing parking at the district level is necessary, in my mind, if you're going to reduce parking in individual projects, because you have to make sure there's a sufficient pool of parking in that area, which there in a downtown area, there almost always is.
It's true. Another point that I guess it's not really a point. It was more kind of like a story that you shared in your book, is that you talk about how the film and entertainment industry is so linked to place in Los Angeles. You talk about you have a game that you used to play with your kids about you could pick any movie and you could immediately tell them that is actually about planning. That movie has a big planning aspect. And I felt very validated in my own opinion on that. I've been trying to get our university to have like 400 level that could be a graduate level course on film and planning to bring more people into the planning industry. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to let you know that I really felt validated in my thoughts there. I was also curious, when you're teaching these days, do you still use that as an example with your students and how to help establish place? Because you mentioned, we all know downtown Los Angeles because of the entertainment area, but we know it because it's such a vibrant place that the film industry is willing to use it.
Yes. I did a Zoom book event recently with Queen's University in Belfast. And I said, I know nothing about Belfast except what I've seen on The Fall. And they all said, yes, we watched The Fall just to see our neighborhood. And I said, that's what it's like to live in LA. You watch every television show and you see a place where you've eaten, or a place where one of your friends live. What I really mean by that is that film is all about location, and every film story is enriched by its location aspects. You cannot separate a film story from the location where it exists. And it's not so much planning, but an awareness of place. One of the things I do talk about in the book is that everybody experiences place, but not everybody realizes it. And, we experience it every day, every minute of every day, all the time. And we often are critical of it, but we don't have a conscious understanding of the fact that place is created by a series of economic and political decisions that we can participate in. And I think that understanding the role of location and place in filmed entertainment helps us understand how location and place play a role in our daily life. I've known planners in LA who've gone on to work in the film industry. A friend of mine from high school, actually, in upstate New York, went to planning school also. He wound up he just retired. He wound up as one of the leading location managers in Hollywood. He was the location manager for Top Gun Maverick. And actually I mentioned that, and somebody asked me, so how is Top Gun Maverick about planning? And, and then I talked about it was filmed in Ridgecrest outside of LA, and it's sort of dripping with that high desert locale within it. So I think it's the fact that film entertainment always depends so much on location, and that allows us to understand better the role that place and location play in our daily lives.
That's really interesting. And when I was reading the book about film and entertainment, Rear Window is the movie that popped into my head as like a movie that planners can really understand, and it kind of explains what we do day to day. But
Well, we don't chop up people and take
yeah,
them out in
that
garbage
part.
bags, but
No.
but but yes, it is. And it is surprising how often in filmed entertainment, particularly set in cities, how often one of the characters is either an architect or an urban planner. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but that's just sort of the quintessential city career, right?
Mhm.
And it's because it's so linked to the location and place.
Yeah. So this next question is something that I've struggled, and I think a lot of planners struggle to overcome. You talk about how if we don't want our towns flattened to move cars, that we need to get our engineers to think of them more as destinations and not pass through places. And I've worked in smaller communities with like an engineer or two where it's a lot easier to walk across the hall and have conversations and slowly indoctrinate them into the planning field. But in larger departments where you have a whole separate department, in our instance, they're in a completely different building halfway across town. So it's harder to make those connections and to try and get them to rethink. What would you recommend? How do you start to get engineers to think of our towns and our neighborhoods as places and not just ways to push cars through?
I think part of my answer is to relate to them as people and not as engineers. I actually stole that thought, that phrase, from my friend Roger Millar, who I worked with at Smart Growth America. He's now the Washington State DOT secretary. And it was Roger's thought is you do not want your location to be viewed as a pass-through place. You want it to be viewed as a place that you go to. And I think there's a difference between the way engineers think at work and the way they think when they go home. And again, it's a matter of trying to get them to understand how one experiences place. Life is not about always going from one place to another. I mean, right, the journey is half the experience, I suppose, but life is mostly about place and location and settling yourself in that location. And traffic engineers are indoctrinated at an early age to think in a particular way about moving traffic. I can remember Andre Swanee once saying in a speech, traffic engineers are all about pumping cars through babies. We can pump 2,000 cars an hour through that baby, meaning an intersection. And I think one of the things we're coming to learn is that moving cars faster is not the only goal of transportation. The goal is not really moving. The goal is access. The goal is for people to have access to the things they need on a daily basis. And you can do that two ways. One is you can try to get people as fast as they can to those places. The other possibility is to make those places as close to where you live or work as possible. So in that sense, of course, land use and transportation are linked. And typically traffic engineers don't think about it that way. And land use planners feel very, powerless and alienated as a result. So I think partly it's just to get, I have a friend here in Houston who you may have had on your show, Christoph Spieler. He's an engineer, but he thinks like a planner, and he likes to say planners solve problems. So just could define the problem differently for them. Instead of moving cars as fast as possible, what if the problem was, how do you make sure people have access to the things they need readily on a daily basis? That might change everything.
That's an excellent way to reframe the situation and maybe move forward. At the end of your book, you talk about the chip game, and it was very interesting to me as a person who's worked both in larger cities and then very rural communities, and we're trying to figure out where growth should happen. And it ultimately is really the same problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you want to develop over? How do you want to preserve your green space? And I had never thought about giving people pieces of paper or chips to lay it down and show it in such a visual way. So I was wondering if you could talk a little further about this method and how planners can implement it, and how you used it for the Southern California Association of Governments to develop their 2% strategy.
So the chip game emerged originally in Salt Lake City as part of the Envision Utah process, and it was more or less invented by my friend Peter Calthorpe and his colleagues. And Peter and I described that process in great detail in our book, The Regional City, which came out some years ago. And what was really striking about Salt Lake City was, okay, that's a relatively small metropolitan area. It's also a relatively homogeneous population compared to the rest of the country. And so the population in Salt Lake City tends to take a long view, a multi-generational view of their future. And when they lay down the chips, they lay down the chips in a typical suburban way. And then when they realized it was chewing up all the farmland, they started to stack the chips on top of one another. That has been somewhat implemented in Salt Lake City. Now, LA is much, much more difficult, right? Because Southern California is gigantic. It's 200 miles across. So when you gave people chips in LA, they would simply put the chips far away from them, or in a kind of a NIMBY way, they'd kind of slip it in their pocket and pretend that the growth wasn't going to occur. You have to accept that additional growth is going to occur before you can successfully play the game, because other people will simply reject it. It was really striking to realize in LA, particularly in LA, central LA, but also Orange County, for example, that you could accommodate the expected additional growth on a relatively small geographical footprint, that 2% of the land area, if you are willing to do it more densely. And although LA has stopped growing in population now, particularly in LA and Orange County, and to some extent in my former county, Ventura County, we are seeing most new development is far more dense than you would expect. Multifamily development predominates, and single-family development no longer predominates in Orange or LA County. It does in the Inland Empire, Riverside, and San Bernardino County. But we've seen a big shift, and part of that was just thinking about and publicizing the choices and what the choices mean as a result of things like the chip game.
So when I was reading through Place and Prosperity, it seemed that prosperity was equal to good economic development. And if there's communities that aren't working specifically on economic development or don't have like a department that's their focus day in and day out is economic development, as is the case in Lincoln, I was starting to think about what that means for prosperity. Or if you're focusing on creating place and land uses and good development, does prosperity automatically follow?
Not necessarily. I mean, larger economic trends are what they are. So as I say, I grew up in upstate New York, a place that stopped adding population 50 or 60 years ago. Many beautiful old towns are struggling because there have been up to now larger economic forces at work. Similarly, in a place like Lincoln is a little like, I don't know, Austin without the music, right? You have certain built-in advantages because you are both a state capital and a college town. Those are two of the most stable economic anchors you could possibly have. Kind of depends, is that fine? Is Lincoln fine just being like that? Or do you want Lincoln to be something more? Austin has a very specific sense of place. Music is part of that. You know, the sense of place in Austin is in large part derived from music venues and the way the music business works in Austin. And, you know, now there's a statue of Willie Nelson right outside a hotel in downtown Austin. So that was one of the things, the vibe in Austin, which was partly about place, partly about music, partly about the university, actually attracted the tech sector. So I think the question for a place like Lincoln is, are you fine just being the state capital and the university town? Or do you aspire to something more? And if you do, what is that? And how can you be intentional about pursuing whatever it is you want? Mid-sized university towns in the United States are thriving as never before, even as large cities are stagnant or in decline. I think of, you go to Massachusetts, you go to Springfield, Massachusetts, which 100 years ago was a thriving manufacturing town. Now it's struggling. Immediately adjacent is the much smaller city of Northampton, which is where Amherst College is, and it's booming. So how do you leverage the assets you have? And particularly University Town is in an extremely advantageous position for that right now. Having said that, I would say one more thing, which is that if you aspire to an innovation economy, then place becomes very important because you need locations where people bump into each other. You know, the tech companies build these big campuses deliberately so people bump into each other. When Steve Jobs created the Big Apple headquarters, he made sure there were a very small number of bathrooms so people had to run into each other in the bathroom. If you look at the university locations that have created great innovation hubs, they tend to be walkable places where people bump into each other. I think of Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where MIT is located, for example. So that's an essential part of bumping into each other, and in walkable places, in high quality places, is an essential part of the innovation economy everywhere in the country, and is something that I think any university town that aspires to have an innovation economy that spins off from the university, that's something that they should aspire to.
Yeah, that's interesting because we just, how long has it been, Jennifer? Like 10 years since Innovation Campus was first dreamed up and constructed. They took our old fairgrounds, and the university has kind of built out this whole campus, but it's slow to come along. There's a few different tech companies out there, and we've started to attract more tech companies in our West Haymarket district, which is on the other side of downtown. So I think we're slowly getting there, but yeah, it is interesting that we are a very stable economy and have been growing at a slow and low pace for decades now.
Yeah, it all depends on your aspirations.
Especially with Innovation Campus, the newest addition is actually a hotel, with the idea of creating a more prominently walkable area down there to bring in the talent that comes to the university to present. Previously, they would have to stay somewhere downtown, and they wouldn't really be able to stop at the coffee shop and grab a cup of coffee and then go back to their hotel and bump into people. So like you said, Stephanie, it's slow, but it's coming along.
I think that's a good point. I'll give you a contrast, which is the new research campus at Texas A&M, which is in Bryan, Texas. It's 10 miles away from the main campus in College Station. It's just a big, huge loop with individual buildings. And you've got the George H.W. Bush Combat Development Complex there. You've got the Texas Transportation Institute. They're all in separate buildings, separated by parking lots. No one will ever bump into each other. And when it was time to go to lunch, we had to drive to the nearest hotel, which was 6 miles away. I think that is the kind of environment where innovation and interaction will not occur at the level that it should.
This has been a great conversation, and wanted to give you an opportunity to address anything if we missed any main messages or takeaways from the book.
I think the main message, if there is one, is simply that we have to be intentional about both place and prosperity. As individuals, I think it's important that we be aware that we experience place all the time, like I said, and that we participate in shaping what that place experience looks like. As communities, I think we need to be intentional about economic development to make sure that our communities are prosperous and prosperous in an enduring way. Place and prosperity, as I said, don't always go together. Sometimes a location is prosperous without a strong sense of place. Sometimes a location has a strong sense of place, but prosperity has already passed. The enduring lesson that I would take away from that is that when regions or locations that have been depressed bounce back, those locations with strong place characteristics bounce back much quicker and much more strongly and facilitate prosperity for the entire region.
Well, thank you so much for writing the book and for joining us today on Booked on Planning. It's a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, my pleasure, and good luck with both place and prosperity in Lincoln.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That wraps up our conversation with Bill Fulton on Place and Prosperity. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.